I'd like to start by asking you, Charlotte, about the story that's on the front of the paper today. It's a story about the Northern Territory as a failed state, essentially. And I'd like to start by asking you about your first reactions to a story that I think will be the biggest story of the year, a story that was broken on Four Corners 2 weeks ago about the treatment of children in detention in the Northern Territory. Did that come to you as an image first? How did that story come to you, and how did you respond to it?
Yeah, I was actually out the night of the Four Corners show, but I saw immediately on social media the images and, of course, that Abu Ghraib style image of the hooded boy tied to a chair. And I felt what any decent human being would feel, which was utter despair, I think, and shame, the deepest shame that I think I've had about our country. And that's saying something, because I've had a lot of shame in recent years about the way we treat vulnerable people. But, you know, it was interesting to me that it's kind of heartbreaking as a novelist to understand that images do work that words don't do. And that Aboriginal people have been telling about this stuff for years, begging for help, presenting every bit of evidence they could. The government has seen those images and thought they were fine. I mean, this is what's kind of so shocking, is the disconnect between people in power and the populace, is that the authorities in the Northern Territory and the broader governments of our country see that image of that boy on the chair and think, oh, well, you know, that...
Well, worse than that, the authorities look at that and say, what we need to do is legislate so that this is legal.
Yeah, and also that the knowledge that this is going on is... you know, we should do more of it. Half the time, that's what they're thinking.
Well, this is the thing. You know, there was political support for this. This kind of law and order stuff in the Northern Territory had been a popular platform for the Country Liberal Party. There was a view that if you talked about locking up black kids, you would be a popular government. Yeah. And they had been a popular government. They're no longer a popular government. They're a hugely dysfunctional government. In about 3 weeks' time, they'll probably lose every seat that they hold. It'll be the first time.
But those views won't go away.
They won't.
And that's what's distressing, I think. And so, I mean, I'm an artist. I'm not a commentator, and I'm not. You know, I don't feel that I'm highly equipped to commentate to everybody here about this stuff, but I think I feel what many people feel, which is a great despair about anything changing. And, you know, with the Royal Commission, yes, it was great that a Royal Commission was announced immediately, but my first thoughts were of the Royal Commission into black deaths in custody, and the fact that those deaths have increased by 50% since that Royal Commission. So what? What's a Royal Commission going to do, especially a Royal Commission that will not look at any other state or territory? And I know Christina Olsen, who's got a really beautiful portrait in the paper today, who's a Queensland writer and a beautiful writer, has done a lot of work with Sisters Inside, organisation for, in women's prisons in Queensland. And she said... She was staying at my house the day that those images came out, and I said, you know, this is like something out of Abu Ghraib. And she said, well, it's funny you say that, because I wrote a letter to the Queensland Corrective Services Department about things that I had seen in Queensland prisons with women, and I used those words about the things that I'd seen, and that got us kicked out of the prisons. So the response is not to say, really? Let's look at this. The response is to say, shut up and get out. And that's why these images have worked to create this sort of outrage, but outrage disappears very quickly.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing about royal commissions. They quite often don't tell us things we didn't already know, but they tell us things with a certain authority that cause us to refuse to look away. And I think the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse that Julia Gillard established has not told us terribly new things, but I think it's altered the public's relationship to the church and to institutions that have allowed and covered up child abuse. And I wonder if it's almost like the job of fiction sometimes. It's the job of showing, of bearing witness and showing.
I agree. And, I'm a novelist. I hope that fiction has that effect. And I know that with my book, The Natural Way of Things, people have said to me it's given voice to something, or it's made them see things that they hadn't connected before or whatever. But what we need is not just recognition, it's action. So we need to take that horror and do something with it. And that's why, The Natural Way of Things it's a book about young women in a prison, which was sparked by a documentary I heard about the Hay Institution for Girls in the 60s and 70s, which is a terrible, brutal, sadistic prison for young women who were sort of wayward in some way. Now, the things that were done to those young women and the things that are being explored in the Royal Commission into institutional sexual abuse are being done now in Nauru and on Manus Island. So we're all wringing our hands and rending our garments saying, how could this have happened? How could we let this happen? And now we've seen, so this can never happen again. Well, it's happening now, and we know it's happening. We're not doing anything. I mean, it really fills me with this.
Yeah. Despair.
Despair that we don't seem... A friend of mine who's done a lot of work in environmental stuff said, I used to think that when facts were presented, people respond. And now, she said, I don't think that anymore. And I know that scientists are in utter despair about, I've read that phrase recently, we live in a post-fact world. And it does seem that way. I was struck in reading the paper last night. There's some great stuff about climate science. And I thought, this government despises artists and scientists in equal measure. And I thought that's...
Because they deal in truth, I suspect.
And, well, they challenge, I think, and they investigate and inquire and draw connections between things that maybe are not often connected. And, it's funny because I've always, in my younger days, thought art and science were at some sort of opposite ends of things. And now I think we're both over here. And governments with short-term interests it seems that the only interest in sort of all governments is to get re-elected. And... I'm sorry I feel so... I'm sorry.
It's a cheery session. Yeah, unfortunately, we're discussing the news. It's always going to be like this.
It's basketball.
I am interested in the way in which news feeds your fiction writing. Obviously, your last book came out of an encounter with the world of non-fiction. Do you read newspapers looking for stories in that respect, or do things get under your skin and just stick there?
It's funny because I'm known amongst my friends as someone who avoids the news at all costs. So I felt very alarmed being here this morning. But I suppose what I love as a reader of newspapers is the story behind the story. And that's one of the things I really do love about the Saturday paper is the length and the investigations and the sort of thoughtfulness of the work, especially, I have to say, by Martin Mackenzie Murray, who's a beautiful writer and has, to my mind, a really a kind of literary sensibility in his approach to all the stuff he does. It's very subtle and interested in imagery, and as well as being very hard-hitting, you know. But there is a sort of length of thoughtfulness about the approach. So, you know, the kind of news and current affairs that I absolutely hate is stuff like Q&A.
Right.
I can't stand it. I can't stand the setting up of outrage and having two completely opposing camps screaming at each other. It's like, what does that tell us? There's no inquiry in that. There's no seeking out of common ground to try and understand something. So I suppose, you know, if there is any way that my fiction responds to the news, it's about trying to inquire beneath the surface of things. I think that's what artists do.
But does a story creep up on you and you find it recurring in your mind and then it becomes for you a novel? Or how does that happen with, because, you know, your books do come out of the news sometimes?
I suppose it's, I think many fiction writers talk about starting out with some sort of problem. And in fact, I just did my PhD, and there's a creativity researcher called Csikszentmihalyi, whose sort of seminal work was in what was called problem finding. And it was about, and I think, again, this is possibly a parallel with scientists, is about the work beginning with looking for a problem and creating a problem that you then solve. Mm-hmm. And I suppose for me, the natural way of things, and here in that documentary, the problem that I was interested in, or the thing that I was seeking to understand, was the fact that many of the women in Hay and in the Parramatta Girls' Home were there not so much because they were sort of sexual and in an unacceptable way, but because they talked about it. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of not the first thing but the second thing. And the fact that they spoke up about things that had happened to them, if they just shut up, they would have been left alone. But because they spoke, that was their crime. And that's when I started realising that this is still going on everywhere, that if women speak out against misogyny, that's when they get punished. Mm-hmm. If they just shut up, it's fine. So I suppose it's that trying to get to the heart of something about me as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's always something about what I don't understand that the book is a way of trying to work out what it is that I don't understand. And sometimes, you know, it resolves in my mind and sometimes it doesn't. But the inquiry is the reason for doing it.
Yeah. And then when you sit down to interview someone, when you write the sort of non-fiction that you write for us, what parts of you as a novelist are there, and what parts of you become a journalist?
Yeah, I love doing those portraits, and I'd love to have time to do more. I love those because...
I'm commissioning you live on stage.
I like the observational nature of them. And the one that I did... The first one I did was of the painter Anne Thompson. I don't know if anybody knows her work. She's an amazing painter. When I interviewed her, I thought, God, she's incredible for a 70-year-old woman, her energy. And then I found out she's 82. But so I went to her studio and watched her paint for a bit, and then did the interview. And watching her move, watching the way she sort of stands at a canvas, and the real physicality of her work, that then informed everything she said. And I sort of saw how her speech patterns replicated her physicality on the canvas. So it was great fun to do that sort of, and that the novelist's work is to be an observer. Mm-hmm. So that's really fun in those kind of pieces. I've just got a very new book out called The Writers' Room, and it's interviews with Australian writers, and it's just a sort of Q&A thing. So there's no observational stuff about, you know, the physicality of the person, but I read, you know, as much as I could of each writer's work before I did the interviews. So I guess I observed their work over several years. But I'm interested in asking you as well, with how much do you let an interviewee lead the story, and how much, I mean, I guess it depends on who they are and what you're trying to
Exactly, it depends. I think, in a lot of what the paper deals with is politics, and a lot of the time in politics you're desperately trying to stop the person you're interviewing from leading things and just maybe returning to the point. But then there is a lot of what we do that is just trying to make sense of the world, and when you're making sense of the world, you have to let people lead you, because otherwise you're imposing sense on the world, and I don't think that's the job of journalism. Journalism isn't there to order the things around us. It's there simply to try and catch hold of them. And the only exceptions to that are when you're dealing with things that have a ersatz order or are trying to mislead you, at which point you have to try and not impose an order to them, but trick them out of their constructs. But I mean, I think you were talking about Martin Mackenzie Murray just before, and I agree. His background is not journalism. His background is speech writing, and I'm very happy in the paper that many of the people who write for us aren't journalists in a conventional sense. I really want the paper to be about telling stories, and journalists aren't necessarily the only people who can do that. In fact, journalists often aren't the best people to do that. One thing that comes from his speech writing is that in speeches, you're always looking for moral connections and for emotional connections. He was writing for for politicians, but also for the Chief Commissioner of Police in Victoria. Was his last job before he joined us. And when the Commissioner speaks, he is often dealing with great moral problems and trying to make sense of them. And I feel like that's what Martin does in his journalism now, is try to find a way to quickly bring a room of people or a single reader into the place that he wants to be. And this gets back to what you're talking about in terms of allowing a subject to lead a story. His piece this week is about homelessness. Kevin Rudd arrived in office with a platform to halve homelessness by 2020. We're much closer to 2020 now than we were then, and homelessness raw numbers, have only increased.
And a lot of the people interviewed in this story, people who work in the homelessness area, say how despairing they were that it wasn't even mentioned during the election campaign. Not even mentioned once by anybody. That's pretty devastating.
When you think that there's somewhat more than 100,000 people each night in the country who are homeless, and there's something like 10,000 crisis beds. It's these sort of, and this is where I suppose it is great occasionally to allow journalism to fill those numbers with things that aren't numbers, to fill those numbers with stories.
Well, I think that's what Martin Mackenzie Murray is particularly good at, is being a very good sort of investigative journalist, but bringing a real humanity to all of those stories. And I remember his stuff about sexual abuse in the church, and a lot of his stuff about domestic violence. And that there is, so in this story, which is this one on page 1 and inside, he talks to homeless people as well as the experts and whatever, and he brings the truth of the experience, which is the kind of thing that you would hope politicians would get, but they I don't know what happens.
Truth is a dangerous commodity in politics.
But what about humanity?
I mean, even more dangerous in politics. Both of them can get you into all sorts of trouble. The interesting thing about that piece, one of the interesting things about it is it's largely about Kevin Rudd's attempts to grapple with homelessness, but the main subject of the piece is a homeless man called Kevin. And when I was editing it late on a Thursday night, I got to a bit where it said in 2009, Kevin had a breakdown and moved in with his mother and started abusing marijuana. And
that explains a lot.
I read it twice and thought, I would have heard about this. We do have a little bit more time, and I wonder if there are any questions in the audience or anything that you'd like to open, because I hope that these kind of sessions also allow you to read the paper aloud in some respects or ask questions. There's one just here. There's a microphone Oh, sorry, the microphone's
I've got the
here.
microphone. Okay, you can have it.
It's chaos.
We'll repeat the
We'll
question.
repeat the question, yeah.
I'm really hopeful that the national outrage, which I'm sure that reaction immediately after on social media had to have affected Turnbull's reaction, and I'm really hopeful that that will be longer term than the usual. The other one was your thoughts about the Q&A program, and that was, I'm thinking that perhaps the part of that appeals to we ordinary people is it's an opportunity for people to front those politicians and policy makers and try and get some questions answered.
There's two questions there. The first is about the long-term effect or the impact of the Four Corners program on Dondale Detention Centre and youth custody in the Northern Territory. The second question is about the
My
capacity
disparagement of the Q&A program and how for a lot of people it appeals because it is a chance for ordinary people to front politicians and ask them tough questions, and I do see the value of that.
As to the Four Corners and as to the impact of that...
and it was the impact on Malcolm Turnbull's
yes.
decision.
And, I mean, Turnbull moved very quickly to announce the Royal Commission and is probably to be commended for that. Frankly, the Northern Territory government that had these reports for more than a year beforehand should have already been dealing with it. But
And can I just say that our Federal Indigenous Affairs Minister, who had a chance to see the program on the afternoon before it aired and decided that he really couldn't be asked, didn't pique his interest and he wanted to go out for dinner. That's despicable.
Yeah. And but in terms of the actual effect on Turnbull and I suppose the impact, hopefully, of that Royal Commission, I think the most troubling aspect of the establishment of that Royal Commission, and it has been a bungled establishment to a Royal Commission, it's incredible that you have a commissioner that had to dismiss himself before the commission started and a second commissioner who is already being criticised by the very people he will inquire into, is problematic. But what's really troubling is that when you look at the terms of reference, in the 5-page letters patent that establishes the Royal Commission, there is but half a sentence that refers to inquiry into the causative factors for detention of young Indigenous people in the Northern Territory. An appalling number of young Indigenous people are locked up. An appalling number of the prison population in the Northern Territory are black. And yet the Commission is looking into extremes of abuse, not into why kids who have done things like eat a Freddo fraud that their friend has given them, and this is a real case, being charged at the age of 11 with being in receipt of stolen goods. We have a justice system there that is as punitive as that, and that is not the subject of the Royal Commission. The subject of the Royal Commission is, I think, the less important outrage over what is quite patently mistreatment. I mean, you don't need a hugely expensive Royal Commission to establish that chaining a child to a chair and putting a bag over his head is a bad thing to do.
Yeah, well, until we acknowledge and admit the fundamental racism of charging an 11-year-old kid, that would not, a white kid does not get charged with that crime at 11 years old. So as long as we deny it, I just can't see... I mean, I hope the outrage that you're talking about... The thing is, it's up to us. It's our fault now if things don't change, because it's the outrage that has to be maintained. And that's very difficult when another outrage will happen next week and we go, oh, my God, we've got to focus on this one now. So I do think that we all now bear responsibility for that changing and for the Black Deaths in Custody Royal Commission situation to not happen again. We can't rely on politicians to do it.
We happened to be in Alice Springs last week and attended a protest, and the palpable anger of these Indigenous people was extraordinary to witness firsthand. And you've actually pressed the question because the Aboriginal elder who spoke said, "This cannot cannot be Tuesday's issue. How do you deal with that?
Did everybody hear that?
Yeah. We have in this country a fatigue for compassion. And we have that fatigue because we have been mistreating people in various forms of detention for way too long. We've been locking up black kids in the Northern Territory for decades. We have, for decades, been locking up asylum seekers, both onshore in mandatory detention and now in gulags offshore. And as often as we write about it in newspapers, as often as we find horrific abuses, the sexual violence on Nauru is appalling. The Moss report makes that clear. The Moss report was informed by a lot of reporting that happened in newspapers. Martin Mackenzie Murray again broke many of those stories in the Saturday paper. It doesn't scratch people's humanity. For some reason in this country, we feel capable of just ignoring those terrible things we do to people.
I think that's right. And the despair that I talk about and feel is something that I have to get over. Because I was interested in Sean Kelly, who writes for The Monthly, has a fantastic daily email wrap thing of politics. And he, a couple of weeks ago, said, just a moment, let's think about hope. And it was so fantastic. He said, there are reasons to be hopeful, you know, if you find them and you look for them. And I realised again, and I need to remember this more often, that hope is a moral choice and an ethical choice. And if you do, as I too often do, and just go, it's all terrible, I can't watch it, I can't be distressed anymore by watching the news and whatever, then I am making an ethical choice to abandon these people. And I do think, I mean, I would like to see the media get a little more involved in hope and in bringing some sort of balance in the coverage of news that allows for glimpses of action, of possibilities for change, rather than just slamming us all the time with utterly devastatingly depressing stories about which we then feel no control. And, you know, we have to take control. And one of the ways of taking control is to decide that there is hope.
I think that's the perfect note to end the session on. We do have to make way for the next session, but Charlotte, thank you so much for talking about the news, and thank you everyone for listening.
And thank you, Erik Jensen.